Hi everybody, welcome to today's episode of Building with OpenTok series. My name is Monik, and today we'll be going over how to dial out to a PSTN user from an OpenTok session using Nexmo SIP. So before we begin, I just want to share a couple of slides and talk about the architecture of the sessions, tokens, publishing, subscribing, and other features that we offer. So as you may know, we do these webinars quite often, and so we've covered a lot of topics: recording, Swift for iOS, React Native, and also key topics, such as GDPR and things like that. So if you're interested in this, and if you're interested in signing up for our next one, go check out Crowdcast here, and you'll be able to sign up. And as you also might be aware, that recently TalkBox was acquired by Vonage, and we also have a sister company, Nexmo, that offers a lot of APIs. So if you want to do in-app voice messaging with SMS or SIP trunking, you should definitely check out the Nexmo APIs, and we'll go over Nexmo dashboard in just a little bit as well. For today's agenda, let's talk about the basics. So what are key concepts for OpenTok? What is SIP? And how does OpenTok SIP Interconnect work? And then lastly, how do we tie it in with a SIP provider such as Nexmo, and then go about dialing out to a PSTN user? So sessions, tokens, and publishing and subscribing. Session is a chat room where users interact. Just like this, we're in a chat room essentially, only I'm publishing and everybody else is subscribing to me. This is a unique session ID. It's generated by our app server on our dashboard, and we'll show you how to do that if you want. And then you can also use it to publish and subscribe to streams, signal to each other in a session. A token is an authentication to a session. So each person that is in a session or connects has their own token. It expires after a certain period of time, and you can usually, as a developer, specify that. You can also add metadata in this token to describe a client, but obviously we don't recommend adding personally identifiable information there. And lastly, publishing and subscribing. I think I dug into this a little bit, but it's a way for you to send your video and audio streams, over the network. So I'm publishing right now, sending my video stream, my screen sharing, my face, and my audio, and on the other end, you're subscribing to my streams there. And now this is the whole API model that we have. Here's the client. This is the browser or the mobile device. Here's another client or mobile device. We request information as session ID and token from our app server. And our app server actually makes that request to the OpenTok cloud to generate that session ID. And then you can use that to connect, publish, subscribe, and signal. And we'll dig into this a little deeper because we're going to actually do a live code demonstration with this. Next off, what's SIP? SIP is used for maintaining and terminating real-time sessions, as you can see. It's called Session Initiation Protocol. It's a protocol that's used to connect audio and video, and so you can transmit media packets over this protocol. And it's industry standard as well. And here is our little architecture diagram of what we're going to talk about today. So building off on the API model, we'll make a request from our app server to dial out to a SIP call, which will then hit sip.nexmo.com, and then which will be forwarded to a PSTN phone number. So it can be a mobile device, etc. And we'll show this demonstration in just a little bit. This is our app architecture of what we're going to build in a matter of minutes. And as you can see, you have to have a session ID from TalkBox. You have to have a token. You can set your event listeners. You can start publishing. And then you can request a dial out. And this dial out happens from your JavaScript application to your app server. Then we'll make that dial out go to the SIP URI, and then which will be then forwarded to a phone number. So we're going to go and jump into the live coding. But right before we begin, I want to take a few minutes and talk about the developer centers and the appropriate documentation and the blog post that we have for this topic. So if you're interested in TalkBox Developer Center, just go to talkbox.com/developer, and we'll be dropping all these links in the chat as well. And here you'll find information on how to get started with the different platforms that we offer, the server SDKs, the client SDKs, and different developer guides for specific topics like recording, SIP, and archiving. Then on, we have the Nexmo developer. This is where the documentation lives as well, developer.nexmo.com. And here you'll find relevant tutorials and API reference information on the various products, like SMS, voice, and such. So you'll be able to access all this information, and you can also check out Stitch, which is in developer preview. So definitely give that a shout out. And then here, we'll go into our TalkBox account. In this, we'll be able to create our API key and secret and different projects that we'll be able to need to connect and authenticate. And similarly, we'll do the same thing with the Nexmo dashboard. We have our API keys and secret, and in this, we'll be able to use to authenticate our SIP call. And lastly, this is our blog for integrating the WebRTC with PSTN, and we'll be dropping that link in the chat as well, so you should be able to see that. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and start live coding. So I'm opening up my terminal. Hopefully everybody can see it. In here, I'm going to go ahead and create a directory, and let's call it OpenTok Nexmo SIP. And then we're going to change into this directory. I'm just going to clear that so we have easier reading process. And here, we're going to actually make a few directories. We'll call it public, public.js, and views. So we've created multiple ones, and now we also want to create some files. So index.js, this is where our server will live. Config.js, essentially I'll have all my API keys and secrets stored here. We also want to create a file for OpenTok.js, so the client-side code for the JavaScript that needs to connect to sessions. And lastly, we have our views, and in our views, we want to have this template for HTML where we can take the API key and session ID, render from the server, and use it. So we've created these files. I'm actually going to go ahead and create an Npm project real quick. This way we can install our dependencies. So install OpenTok Express, because that will be used for our app server. And you can use anything. You can use PHP, .NET, any of the SDKs that you're used to using. Or for this example, we'll just use Node. And then EJS for our template. So this is going to be installing. Quick second, and sweet. So this is done. Let's go ahead and just open this in our code here, and I'm going to make this much bigger, hopefully, so everybody can see. And let me see if I can make it a little bigger. So right here, we're actually just going to set our config up, and we'll have separate configs for OpenTok, and then one we'll have for Nexmo. And in each of those, we'll essentially have an API key and secret. API secret, and you can do the same for Nexmo. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over here, and then we'll fill these in when we get closer. In our index.js, which is our app server, essentially that's going to be rendering all our the view and everything like that, handling our requests, we're going to instantiate an express object, and here also loop in OpenTok, because that's the SDK we need to create sessions and do SIP dialout. And here we can also get our config, because that's what we need for our, oops. Sweet, there we go. And we have our config. And now we can create our app server, which is simply done by doing this. We can also want to make sure we let them know that to use the directory for public directory for our JS dependencies. So on the client side, and here now we can go ahead and start creating a method where this is when we make a GET request to the browser, hey, can you give me a room ID and session ID? This is the endpoint it's going to hit. So we'll call it room ID, and this is obviously going to have a callback with a response. And in this request and response, before we render anything, we obviously want to get the room ID, and this information is available in the params. So we can use object deconstruction to get that here. And then now we can do OpenTalk.createSession. But remember, before we do that, we need to create an OpenTalk object. So I'm going to go ahead here and do OpenTalk equals new OpenTalk. And this is going to require our config.opentalk.api key. And then we'll do the same API key secret. And I know it looks like my window is acting up just a little bit, so give me a quick second while I try to utilize as much real estate as possible. So just like that, and here now we have the room ID, So we're going to actually go ahead and do OpenTalk.create session. And in here, we want to use a media mode routed. And this is saying, hey, I want to go through TalkBox's media servers and not just do a peer-to-peer connection, which is required if you want to do a SIP dial-out. And this has an error callback or a session object if there's no error. So we can say if no error. If error, first of all, let's just respond with the status of 500 or whatever you want, and then send that saying, we can send an error, we can send a blank. We'll leave it blank for now. And then on this end, if everything is good, let's go ahead and use that session ID and create a token as well. So we want to create a token because this is what our authentication process is for a session. So we'll do session, and this has a method attached to it, generate token. So essentially you can just pass in. You have the ability to generate a token for a moderator or such as a publisher and subscriber only. So you can define those, but for the sake, we'll just go with the default. And here now we have a token, but after everything, we need to render this information to the browser. So we'll have our index.ejs template that we asked, that we've created, but it's empty. We'll add information there. And then we'll pass in information such as API key, which is our config.opentalk.api key. And here we have our session ID, and then we have our token, and then the room ID. And we'll be using the room ID to do a few lookups. So now this is great, but one of the things we'll be having issues with is if somebody reloads the page with the same URL address, they're going to be put into a different session. And we don't want that because we want to put them all in the same session. So we're going to do some little putting things in the memory about the room ID to session ID mapping. You'd probably use like Redis or like Firebase and things like that to do it, or any other database. But let's go ahead and set this here. So when we create a session ID, we can say, okay, app.set for this room ID, I want to map it to this specific session ID. And when we get this request, initially we should be like, okay, if this room ID exists in our memory, let's actually go ahead and just use that and get our session ID like this. And after we get our session ID, we can go ahead and use that to create a token. So we can actually create a token and say OpenTalk.generate token. We can pass in the session ID. Now you'll notice we're making this call in the OpenTalk object and not the session object. And the reason for that is because we don't have the session object like we did here, OpenTalk has this utility function to create a token and generate it if you pass in the session ID. So now everything is great. We still need to render this information. So what we can do is actually create a utility function here, help out, so we can reuse some code. So I'm going to call this render room. And here I'll have some response. That's what we're going to use to render. And I'll pass in an API key so we can render that, session ID, a token, and a room ID. And in here, we essentially will be like, okay, response.render, just like we did, .ejs, and I'm going to just copy and paste this because we've already written this out. But this is simply going to be API key. So in order for this to work properly, we obviously have to pass in this information to render room, and we can do that here. So we'll just say render room. Let's pass in this response object along with the API key. We have to define that still. We'll do that in just a second. Token and our room ID. And this information is all available here. So let's actually just get our API key from config.opentalk. And now we don't have to do that. And here we can put all this information in an else statement. So, hey, if this room doesn't exist, let's go ahead and actually create one from scratch. And this room as in the session ID, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll do the same thing. And we'll set it here. And we don't need to render anything here. And we'll just call the same function. So this utility function is going to help us. As I said, this is only in memory. So if you restart your server, everything's going to be empty again. So obviously, you'd like to probably have some sort of persistent database that'll hold this mapping information for you. So now that we've created a basic room section, now let's go ahead and create something for our dial-out. This is what we're going to do for our SIP dial-out information. So here, we're going to get information such as the room ID from the request the client's going to make, and the phone number, because that's what they're going to pass us into, so we know where to call. And this phone number here is going to come through the query. We're just using get request, and we'll do the same thing. If app ID exists, so we can find the session ID. Let's actually get the session ID. excuse me. So we got the session ID here, and we still need to create a token. I'm going to call this SIP token just because this is for a SIP client. So even though you already have a token here for your other clients, the SIP user also needs their own token, and we'll have to send that in as a request, as part of our request that we make in just a little bit. So we'll have the OpenTok object create generate a token for us, and we'll pass in the session ID here. And so we have a SIP token. We also need a SIP URI, and this is actually going to be SIP colon with the phone number that we send in. So, oops, there you go, at sip.nexmo.com. So that's going to be the SIP URI. And now to actually make this call, you're going to call a method called dial on the OpenTok method. You pass in the session ID, the SIP token, the SIP URI, and we'll actually have to add some options here so we can authenticate the Nexmo end so they know that this request is coming for this specific API key in secret. And to do that, we're actually going to we're going to do this here, API secret, and this is actually going to come from our config from Nexmo that we'll set up in our config file just after this. So now I have some things called save options. This is going to be an object with a key saying it's for auth, and here I have a username property, and this is going to be my API key, and this is my Nexmo API key, and I'll have a password, which is actually my API secret from Nexmo's end. And here you have a bunch of other properties. You can set custom headers you can pass and things like that. We're going to ignore that part of this for today just because we don't need it. And we can define if we want this to go over RTP or SRTP, which is known as secure RTP. For the sake of a demo, we're just going to go ahead and set this to false. And here, since we've declared the options, we can pass in our SIP options here. And this also has a callback. So either it's going to give us an error or we're going to get some SIP data back. So we'll say, okay, if there is an error, let's respond with a status of 500. I'm just choosing 500 for now, but obviously you want to follow the protocols for sending a 400 if there's forbidden requests and things like that. This is a server error. I'm only saying that because if that happens, we'll send that over there. So send with 500, and we're not going to send any message because just for the sake of the demo. And then here we'll actually get some information such as the connection ID for this client, the session ID, and things like that. So I'm going to use the connection ID. I'm going to store that information because in case I want to force disconnect the PSTN user, I'm going to need that connection ID to do that. So now I've done that. I'm also going to set this in memory just like we did, but I'm going to tie it to a phone number. And the phone number that the client passes in, we'll use that to map it. This will be the key, and the value will be the connection ID. And everything is good here. So dial went through. We're going to respond with a status of 200. And with a body, we can say body could be OK, or you don't have to worry about it if you don't want to send anything. And essentially, we've done the call here. That's for dial out. But obviously, you can see if there's an S. So we have to put an else statement here saying if the room ID doesn't exist. Let's also just send it for 500 because it was an error. Our database didn't have that information. Lastly, we have something called hang up call, and we're going to have this for our clients who want to hang up a SIP call, and we'll use the force disconnect method here from the OpenTok object to disconnect the user. So for the hang up, we're going to copy the same code here because we need this information, the phone number and stuff, and we're also going to simply do okay if room ID if. And I'm only putting this in because we want to make sure this exists before we make any call. But if if you don't want to do it for the demo, you can just go right in. And if this exists, we'll get our session ID from our room ID. We actually need our connection ID, which is from our phone number that we had just set on this line. So we'll say, okay, connection ID here, app.get. And this is for the phone number. So now we've gotten the connection ID and session ID, which are both needed to disconnect somebody from a session. So we have OpenTok, that force disconnect method. We pass in the session ID and connection ID, and obviously a handler. And this will be, okay, if error, we'll do the same thing. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. You can make a utility function to take care of this for you, but you can do it this way. And if everything is good, just send an OK here. And you can obviously, we have an if condition here, so we got to do the same thing here. And we'll send if we can't find any of this information in our memory, we'll send a 500 saying there was some sort of issue going on. So now we have a hang-up method. And lastly, I know there's a lot of code going on here, but lastly, we have to define our port where we want to run this app server on. And we'll do this by process.env, and we have this thing called port. And if we can't have anything there, we'll just set it to 3000 as a default. And we have to do app.listen. This is a method, and then you can define the port here. This also, you can have a callback, and in this callback, you'll say started server on port, and you can do whatever, but here I'm just going to do port. You don't have to have this callback there if you don't want to listen to the message, if you want to go cowboy. So this is pretty important right here. And so now we actually have set up our server. We just need to add the configs. We'll do that at the end, actually. And now, secondary parts, we're going to actually go to our JavaScript here. And I'm actually just going to copy paste this code from something I have written before. The reason is this is something that we've covered in our sessions, but I'll explain it real quick. We have the API key and session ID, which is used to instantiate a session object. We then set event listeners, stream created, stream destroyed. And when a stream is created, this is when you can subscribe to a stream. And when a stream is destroyed, you can handle it however you want. For the sake of the demo, we're going to give an alert, which is usually really bad practice. You never want to alert something and make a blocking activity on the browser, but this is what we're going to do for the demo. And then set our event listeners. We're actually going to use that token to connect. If there's an error, we'll say, hey, there was an error. If not, let's go ahead and instantiate that publisher, and then we're going to publish it. So there's that information. And we're also I'm going to copy paste my HTML template here, which you can essentially do whatever you want. But here, I've added API key, session ID, token, and room ID. This is all coming from the server as we'd set. And then here we have a make request method, and this is going to make requests to our server here for either dialing out or hang up, depending on what we call. And then here we have had the mini dial out method and the hang up method to do that. So looks like there's a comment. I'm going to go ahead and check the comment here. Just a minute while I check the comment. And it says, do you want connection ID rather than connection and hang up in index.js? Yes, so you actually need the connection ID to hang somebody up. It doesn't, the server side does not accept a connection. There's no connection concept on the, like an object on the server. You only have a connection ID essentially. And we can cover all this information as we talk. So thanks for that great question, Nick. And then we're gonna, oh, it looks like there's a typo here. Let's check. Ah, great catch, Nick. Thank you. We would have discovered this when we were trying to force disconnect somebody. But shout out to Nick Darlow for catching this. That means he was paying attention. So thank you so much. I'll say it was a test, but it really wasn't. And then here we'll have information on publisher and subscriber, items that we want to render in the DOM. And you can see I said publisher here. This is the target element essentially where I want to put the publisher. This is the target element where I want to put the subscriber. You don't have to have these. The JS SDK will auto-generate these for you, but we just had it for the sake of the demo. And here, showcase how you can do things. And here we created an input box, a dial-out method, and a hang-up method is what we call. So now we've done some great things here. If anybody can guess, there's one thing that we're still missing. We need to add our config. And this is something we'll get from our dashboards. So I'm going to go ahead into this OpenTok dashboard, TalkBox dashboard. I'm going to create an account. So it says create new project, and you'll be there was two options, the embeds or the OpenTok API. Since we're taking full functionality of the APIs, and we're going to go ahead and click create custom project, and we'll call this building with OpenTok Nexmo SIP. And you can choose a codec. We're not going to get into that right now, but if you have any questions about H264 and VP8, definitely check out our documentation. We cover it in great depth. We're going to go ahead and create this project. This is going to generate an API key and secret for me and some other configurations that I can set up in this project. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'll be deleting this API key and secret, so don't plan on using it, So you can essentially see insights here. So the usage data, the errors, the quality, the different endpoints, the location your users are coming from. You also have the ability to set some project settings, session monitoring. So if you wanted to get session events, you can do that here. SIP call monitoring, if you wanted to have it. So for our specific case, we're not setting up SIP call monitoring, but it's in beta. You can get things like when the invite was sent, if there was a hang up, things like that. You can get this all on the server side. And then here, you have a lot of information about archiving. You can set your callback URL, connect your AWS or S3 or Azure bucket, and then a bunch of other tools here to generate tokens on the fly. Now, we have all this information, so let's go ahead and add our API key and secret to our document here. But this is for OpenTok, so we need two sets. We need one from Nexmo and one from OpenTok. So secondly, we have to go to our Nexmo dashboard. In the Nexmo dashboard, you can access different types of applications that you have. So if you have an SMS, voice, verify, and the usage for this, if you wanted to look at analytics by the day, and then Stitch, all these information is available. We only need our API key and secret for this. I'm going to go ahead and copy that here, and then this secret, no longer a secret since this is a webinar, but this is something that you would want to only hold on your app server and not disclose to anybody, because this gives you the power to make calls and send SMSs, and on the TalkBox side to create sessions and tokens and things like that. So we've added all this, and now let's see if our code that we've written is going to work. So I'm going to go to my terminal, and I'm just going to say node index.js. That's where we created it, and it looks like we're having some issues here in our index.js. And oh, yep, we're missing something here. So we actually have to use this middleware here, and that's why. But let's go ahead and give this another shot. Oh, no start, because we haven't added that as a script. We'll just do sweet. So server starting. That doesn't mean our code fully works yet. We'll check that out in just a bit. So I'm going to go ahead to localhost 3000. Remember, we had this room parameter, and you can see I tested a lot of stuff right here before. But you had this room parameter. Essentially, this is going to be dynamically generating room IDs. We'll call this webinar. And if everything works, we should be publishing. So you should be able to see me again. Hey, everybody. And this is coming from a different camera just because I'm using two. So you can see me there. And now let's see if our application works. I'm actually going to dial out to a phone number that I have here. This is a phone number, and let's see if I can press dial. And if everything works correctly, we'll see a box. So that's great news. And in about 1 to 2 seconds, I'll probably get a phone call. As you can hear, so I'm going to answer. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. You can see the feedback. You can hear things. If I want to hang up, and then we got our alert because we got a connection that was destroyed, and boom. We essentially just used an OpenTok session, and we dialed out to a PSTN user and connected them in the session. So this is really great, because what that allows you to do is, if somebody can't make it to a call, if somebody can't make it, they don't have access to WebRTC connection, but they have a phone, you can dial out to them. You can get them connected to the session. And now I want to kind of go back to our document here that we talked about the architecture. So in this architecture, we said, okay, we're going to make a call to get our API key, session ID, and token. And that's when we make the request to the room ID and that specific path that we've set. When that happens, we make a call to create session for OpenTok. So as you can see here, we'll be like, okay, so if the room doesn't exist, we're going to go ahead and make a call to create a session. We're going to use the routed mode, and then we're going to get a response back. And depending on what that item is, we're going to return session ID, token, and the room ID that we have. And then we're going to, apologize for that. We're going to set our event listeners and connect. We'll create a publisher and publish. So super simple process, and then we're going to just dial out. And that's exactly what we did in this demo. As you can see, it didn't take longer than 20 minutes, but that's because I've had some practice. So if you want to check this out, we have a repo. We'll be dropping the links for the repo, which we've already done. And you can clone it. You can start dialing out and connecting the PSTN users from OpenTok. So we're going to go ahead and now take some questions. Make sure you fill out the polls. We've asked some questions about if you're using SIP and if you plan on using SIP, and also, so please do answer the polls for us, and then make sure to sign up for our next week's webinar or next month's webinar on how Nexmo in-app messaging and adding that to an OpenTok session. So if we want to add chat capabilities to a video application, we should be able to use Nexmo in-app messaging to do that. So let's go ahead and actually. I'm going to go back to this slide so we can take some questions. And right now we have 2 questions. One of them says, hey, I'm looking for TalkBox Unity cross-platform SDK. It'll be great for AR development. That's correct. Unity is really helpful for AR development. We don't have a cross-platform SDK, but it's something that we've had a few requests for, so we might be considering that. The Unity, we have samples for ARKit on iOS. We have a Unity samples for Windows SDK, so definitely check that out, and we'll drop the links in there. But yeah, so let me know if you have any questions on that specifically. Do we have some webinar sample with Xamarin? Unfortunately, we don't. We have not planned a Xamarin webinar, but if there's an interest, we can definitely try to do that for you. We don't officially have a Xamarin SDK, but we do have a partner, Dream Team, that maintains our Xamarin SDK. They update it when we do new client releases. So if you have any questions with that, I recommend getting in touch with Dream Team or give me an email. My email is monik@talkbox.com, and I can get you with the right folks and help you out with the Xamarin end as well. Question from Anders, what about the opposite? Can a call initiated from PSTN to be connected to an existing OpenTok session or create a new one and signal somebody that they should join to normal session handling? It's a great question. This is theoretically possible with SIP providers. So we're working on samples, and it's a feature down the line that I believe Nexmo will be able to hopefully support. And what that allows you to do is essentially dial out from the OpenTok session and have somebody dial in and use the bridging in the middle to connect the folks over WebRTC and SIP. And Anders, if you have any questions, definitely send me an email, and I can see what I can help you with. But just letting you know, it is possible, and you can connect to a different SIP provider, or we'll be working on the feature hopefully in the near future. So we've answered all the questions. Definitely answer all the polls, folks. So we have questions on the polls. And this is what we're going to go over on the polls. So the first question was, do you connect PSTN users in your application? Somebody said, do you need to connect? Sorry. Somebody said, no, but I'm thinking about it. So there's folks that are thinking about it. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully this is information, and hopefully the samples help you out as well. And then if they are using it, it looks like we have some use cases. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any use cases here, but definitely drop us your use case if you're using SIP to connect PSTN, because I would love to know how the application is working. And then folks, if you're already using SIP, some people are already using it, some people are not using it with OpenTok. So I recommend using it with OpenTok so you can connect your providers here. But if you're thinking about it, hopefully this was great, helpful for you. And if you have any questions, you can also check out the blog post. This blog post is super helpful because it walks through the same code, but essentially it's a blog instead of a webinar, similar style, setting everything up. So that's also helpful as well. If anybody doesn't have any questions, we'll give one more minute for questions. And then meanwhile, please do register for the next one. I think it's important to add messaging to a complete video application. So we'll be showing you how to do that. So we'll make just a minute. All right, looks like we won't have any more questions. So thank you everybody for your time today, and we'll see you in the next episode.